Good afternoon and welcome to this EPC election monitor event today. Today we will discuss the surprising, rather shocking outcome of the Dutch elections and analyze its impacts on national politics and explore the implications, of course, for the European Union. What happened last week on November 22nd in Netherlands? This election took place in a rather exceptional circumstances, we would say, that was marked by the departure from politics of Mark Rutte, the country's longest-serving head of government. In the snap elections, the PVV, Party for Freedom, a far-right party, gained 37 seats, to the surprise of its own leader, Geert Wilders, which is 20 more compared to their previous results, the amount of the seats. In the second place, we have political alliance between Green Left and the Labour Party, with lead candidate Frans Timmermans, who himself expects to be in opposition, received 25 seats. Mark Rutte's party, the VVD, People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, secured 24 seats, losing 10 seats. And Peter Omtzigt's New Social Contract Party gained 20 seats. The outcomes of these elections, of course, bear significant importance for the European Union. The Netherlands is often a pivotal player within the European Union. It is the biggest of the EU's small economies and a large net contributor to the EU's budget. Well, with these election results, the implications for the EU have further intensified. Not only are there questions about the Dutch position in the European Union, but also whether this cements a far-right surge in Europe, potentially changing the course of the European Union. So what did these results occur? What do they mean for the European Union's policies and politics? And what lessons should the EU learn ahead of the European Parliament elections in 2024? These are some of the questions that I will discuss with our speakers today, and I'm very happy and glad to introduce them today to our audience. I'm very happy that I'm joined by Elisabeth Kuiper, Associate Director and Head of the Social Europe and Wellbeing Programme at the European Policy Centre. Welcome, dear Elisabeth. Rem Korteweg, Senior Research Fellow, the Clingendael Institute. Thank you very much, Rem, for joining us today. And Sam van der Staak, Director, Regional Europe Programme of International IDEA. This conversation is being recorded, and please also, I would like to remind our audience, and I'm very happy that today we are joined by more than 140 participants, that you can prepare your questions in the Q&A box and perhaps already start sending them, and then I will try to incorporate during the Q&A session. We have an hour, so I would like to perhaps already start and kick off our panel. And I would like to start, dear Elisabeth, with you. Perhaps you can share with us your key takeaways of the election results, but also discuss the election campaign. You have recently published very interesting flash analysis, a reaction to the Dutch elections, where you also elaborate the key campaign messages. So what's your takeaways, and what have been the key campaign messages in this election, which took place in a rather fragmented political landscape? The floor is yours, dear Elisabeth.
Well, thank you so much, Teona, and good afternoon to all of you. It's good indeed to discuss these results, and also good to have indeed Rem and Sam with us for indeed analysis of the Dutch elections, because I'm sure that all of us over the last couple of days have been really indeed reflecting on how it comes that indeed this has been described as a shock result, as you said, but also very much, I think, a warning signal for the European Union. Because after all, and I remember very much from the time when I was working at the Dutch Parliament representation, the Netherlands presents itself as the biggest of smaller member states and the smaller of the biggest member states. So it has quite a crucial position indeed in that middle position. And therefore, it's very much important to see that despite the fact that the European Union was largely absent from the elections campaign, there will be consequences either way. And I'm sure that we're going to discuss the potential options for the weeks and the months to come about what coalition and the likelihood of a coalition is likely to emerge from all of this. But if you look carefully at the program that Wilders from the Freedom Party presented, there are huge consequences for the EU, because he speaks very clearly about, for example, the need to slash EU funds, so less money to the EU. Eventually also he speaks a potential Nexit, so the Netherlands leaving the EU. When it comes to Ukraine, it's very well known that in the past he had a more pro-Russia stance. And when it comes to the support of the Netherlands for the war in Ukraine, he already said indeed he's not in favor of sending weapons to Ukraine. Of course, that links to enlargement as well, where he's also not in favor of enlargement of EU member states. If you think about the fact that also in elections, of course, climate change and the green agenda had played a role, especially in terms of the cost of living and the need for a fair transition. All of that, of course, will have consequences of the Dutch stance at EU level. Not to speak about, for example, the whole discussion about EU governance reform, where I think the Netherlands already are oftentimes part of a coalition that are called the Frugals. But again, if we were to have a more skeptical or even a more right-wing coalition, then of course that will really change the position of the Netherlands in the EU. I think an important point, and I think that's potentially also something that we're going to discuss, is indeed the question about the far right or populist parties indeed gaining pace at EU level. Because whereas perhaps in October, people were becoming a little bit more positive after the win of the pro-EU liberals in Poland, I think now indeed there is again the worry that this is going to be a trend. And indeed, especially when it comes to topics to do with migration, with a green agenda, that are clearly topics that cannot be dealt with at national level. Indeed, it is very important to look at the trend at EU level. At the same time, and I think there is a nuance that we also need to take into account. You indeed said that when it comes to the percentages, it's indeed 25% of the Dutch voters that voted for this party, this populist party. But the Netherlands very much has a coalition system. So again, we will need to see, because the first signals from the other parties that won already are that they're much more hesitant or taking a more cautious approach about the likelihood of having a coalition with Wilders and taking part in such a possible coalition. So again, the likelihood that we will have an exit anytime soon is not very realistic. So I think it's always very important if you look at the different countries at stake. And I think in that respect, it was very telling that I think within the hour after the first election poll on Thursday evening, Marine Le Pen had sent indeed a tweet with "Félicitations à Monsieur Wilders," and also Orban came in with the winds of change. So you clearly see also, for example, in Slovakia, that indeed there are countries where are, those trends happening. At the same time, I think we need to have a more granular perspective on why has this happened in a specific country and what are the explanations for that. So I think I keep it at that because I'm also very much looking forward to Rem and Sam, and I'm sure that we're getting questions already in.
Indeed, dear Elizabeth, thank you so much for elaborating on this on this key aspects of the election campaign, but also discussing already the implications for the EU, which we will also in depth discuss during the discussions. And now I would like to ask Rem perhaps to also guide us through the elections. What happened? So why also did the polls fail to predict this outcome, and perhaps also elaborate about the potential scenarios of the government creation? Wilders posted on social media today, tomorrow, or the day after, I will become prime minister of this beautiful country. Will he?
Well, he'd like to be, but I think asking the question is almost answering it, because I think, like Elizabeth said, the Netherlands is a coalition country, and I'll say a couple of few words about that in a second. Your other question is, why did the polls fail to predict the landslide? Well, not the landslide, but like the big massive surprise of the Wilders victory. And if you talk to the pollsters, they will say, well, we didn't fail to predict this. We consistently showed that there was, particularly in the last 2 weeks, an enormous upward momentum behind voting for Geert Wilders. And we could get into why that is. Some of it has to do with a number of strategic choices taken by some of the other candidates. But the pollsters also said consistently that there was a huge chunk of the electorate that simply hadn't made up their mind. That about 35% of the electorate simply on the day before the elections was still, up in the air. And this is, I think, an interesting notion to take on board, that not only is the Dutch political system deeply fragmented, we had 26 or 27 parties that put forward candidates for this election, and we're returning, I think, anywhere between 18 and 20 parties in the upcoming parliament. And secondly, the notion that we always have massive swing votes, so massive amounts of people that aren't loyal to one or the other political party. And so that makes you susceptible to two things. One is to highly unpredictable political results. And secondly, that if as a party you are able to attract, say, 20%, or in the case of Wilders, 23.8% of the electorate, you are the massive winner. And that's I think a feature of Dutch politics that we've seen over the past couple of decades, that this sense of political fragmentation is just continuing, and it makes our political system susceptible to these swings. So a couple of months ago, we had provincial elections, and the farmer citizens movement became very big all of a sudden, out of the blue, unexpected. But if you look at the amount of votes that party gets, it's not astronomical. But because of the fragmentation of our system, it actually skews in favor of these new parties, or parties that all of a sudden have a large amount of momentum behind it. I want to touch on two things, if I may, Teona, which is, and Elizabeth already flagged this. Keep in mind, when thinking about the victory of Wilders, that Wilders didn't get an absolute majority. He has to form a coalition, and this is going to be deeply problematic for him. And so he might tweet that he will be the next prime minister, but to be honest, I wouldn't necessarily put my salary on that yet. And we already saw that there are some struggles in terms of simply exploring what type of coalitions might be possible. So in our system, the largest party gets to take a first stab at trying to form a coalition. And as a technical step to do that, that party then appoints what we call an explorer. So someone who goes by the parties and starts to assess positions. Now, that person was appointed on Friday, and this morning's news is that that person has already resigned. Because, and this is a feature of Wilders and the people that he brings together, that a lot of the people that support him and are political fellow travelers tend to also attract a certain amount of scandals. And so this person who you would consider to be a safe pair of hands to explore what type of coalitions is possible actually has a number of fraud cases surrounding that person. And this is not uncommon. This is something that Wilders has had to confront over the past 2 decades that he's been in parliament, where he's trying to build his own party. He isn't able to attract like a stable cadre of people that are reliable, and this is going to be a problem for him moving forward. He is very much a single person party. I mean, he is literally a single person party because his party only has one member, namely himself. And so this is going to create structural problems for him to be a credible coalition partner, even if he's the largest. Secondly, there is a possibility that he isn't able to form a coalition, and then there is, an alternative that emerges. So the only alternative of a Dutch government following from these election results that doesn't contain Geert Wilders' party is one led by Frans Timmermans. And I don't think at this point we can entirely rule out a scenario where Timmermans becomes prime minister. And this would be a coalition government based around 4 parties, where the Greens-Labour combination led by Frans Timmermans is the largest, supported by the VVD, supported by the NSC, Omtzigt, and probably supported by the Liberal Democrats. That's a very difficult combination to see emerge right now. But having said that, we are really only just at the start of this journey of forming a coalition. The elections, if you will, are really only the end of the beginning, namely the division of seats. And now this coalition needs to be created. And what people say, which parties are being excluded or positions that are being taken, are all going to be up for grabs again. So do not take what you read today as symptomatic for what the next Dutch government is going to look like. We really do not know. And I mean, we'll talk about this later, but let me finish with one or two thoughts. One is, we're going to enter a very long, complex, difficult, and probably turbulent coalition formation process. I cannot imagine that a coalition government is going to be formed very quickly. And we already seen that with the VVD already excluding going into a coalition government with Wilders at the moment. Secondly, whatever coalition emerges, whether it's one led by Wilders or whether it's one led by Timmermans, is probably, in my view, going to be quite short-lived. There are going to be massive structural problems that both these coalitions are going to have to confront. Wilders, because he's not used to governing, he doesn't have people that he's able to combine around him that are, realistic four-year leadership material. On the other hand, a Timmermans VVD NSC combination is going to be very tricky as well in terms of really reaching the finish line of the four-year parliament. So my assessment is we're going to have a very long coalition formation process and a very short coalition. And that has implications for the way in which we're positioned inside the EU. But let's leave that for the subsequent discussion.
Excellent, dear Rem. Thank you so much for these very interesting reflections. And indeed, as you mentioned, it's not something new, right? For Dutch politics, the coalition government and the formation of the government takes much longer than we expect, right? If we also look at the previous experience, it was more than 200 days, I think 290 days that the government took the time to create. And in this case, as you said, we might expect even worse. So, dear Sam, I would like to also now ask you for your reflections when it comes to the state of democracy or potential threat to democracy in case Wilders manages to create the government. And German EU minister stated that the high level of support for anti-European forces in the Netherlands is bitter. All pro-Europeans must now work to ensure that this does not happen again in the European elections, because Europe protects our freedom, our democracy, and our security. Do you think that these values can be at stake in case Wilders succeeds and becomes the prime minister?
Thank you, Teona, and thank you to EPC for inviting me. Two observations to start with. So, of course, the whole of the EU got a shock when they learned about the election outcome, as well as a lot of Dutch voters. I think we should read this outcome more as a sign of distrust in government than a sign of support for all of Geert Wilders' plans. The distrust in government is quite significant. It's the result of three parallel crises that have taken place over the past 2 years. One to do with a farmer buyout scheme that really upset rural areas. Two, natural gas extraction in the province of Groningen that ignored health and safety of citizens for decades, that was also blew up last year. And then three, a childcare benefits scandal in which citizens were falsely accused of fraud. So these crises have really led to a serious dent in trust in government that doesn't necessarily mean that people are in support of all of Wilders' plans, but that they are looking for new voices. And it was already mentioned just 8 months ago, a completely different and very new party, Farmers' Party, won the provincial elections. Just 3 weeks ago, another new party, NSC, was polling on top. And it's just in the past week that PVV of Wilders suddenly came out as the largest party and that was largely due to how the campaign developed and campaign strategies that you saw by different parties. So I think we should read these results mostly as a sign of dissatisfaction in government rather than a support of all of Wilders' plans, including his plans regarding the EU. So that's observation number one. Observation number two has been mentioned already by the two other speakers. The Netherlands are a country of coalitions for which a minimum of 2 or 3 even other parties may be needed to form a new government. 3, if we're also looking at the Senate, so to get a Senate majority will be very difficult. So 2 or 3 other parties would be needed to form a new government, all of which are more centrist than PVV. So compromises will be necessary. Will this mean any form of backsliding, democratic backsliding for the Netherlands, as you asked, Teona? Will the Netherlands be the next Hungary, Slovakia, or Poland as it was for the past 8 years? Well, there's good reasons to think there's a risk because indeed, Wilders in the past has called for unconstitutional policies. Right? He's called for a ban on all forms of Muslim migration, banning the Quran, doing away with Islamic schools, all things that go against fundamental rights and international treaties. He's criticized the judiciary and the media for being politicized and left-wing. He's called for the abolishment of public media. He's called the parliament a fake parliament. So all signs that we've seen in other countries as well that are the forebearers of democratic backsliding. There's a level of disdain for checks and balances that he has voiced for years. At the same time, we've not heard him, as far as I can tell, talk about any fake elections. So that rhetoric that we heard from Trump in the US, I don't think he's ever called the Electoral Commission a fake commission that we should distrust. He doesn't own media channels of his own, as we see in other countries. So signs of state capture, we're not seeing at this stage. So I'm a little bit less concerned about that type of backsliding and state capture that we've seen in other countries. And more importantly, other parties will prevent it because of that coalition system. And I think that's what's going to happen over the next couple of days. Indeed, Parliament will appoint a new scout after the initial scout was this morning dismissed. And I suspect that that scout will first hear from all the other parties that may join government, what are your red lines? And probably those parties will say, there's 3 red lines. One is the rule of law. We will not step into any government that violates the constitution. 2 is Nexit. I suspect that all other parties will say Mr. Wilders will have to give up on his Nexit claims. And 3 is Russia policy or Ukraine policy. So Wilders will have to openly say that his policies that we know from a couple of years ago, when it comes to Russia, he no longer supports. I think he will compromise easily on all 3 points, if only because he's already said that he's going to stick to the constitution. He's going to give up on some of his stronger rhetoric on rule of law. And on Nexit, I think he probably makes the assessment that he stands to win from staying in the EU at this stage. With the way things are going, there's more and more right-wing parties, like-minded parties that are in government in Europe. So my suspicion is that he feels it's better to stay in as the winds of change, as Orban called it, are starting to blow, rather than being out and having no say over the future of the EU at all anymore. So my feeling is that he will compromise quite easily on some of these red lines, and that once these are cleared, they will be able to talk about future domestic policy. And that domestic policy is probably a lot EU related. So we will see a lurk to the right if a new government is formed, a right-wing government by 3 or 4 parties that will affect EU policy. 1 is on migration, 2 is on climate, on fiscal and economic policy, where the Netherlands indeed is traditionally quite frugal, and possibly on enlargement. I don't think the Netherlands will abandon its support to Ukraine, even though Mr. Wilders has taken an anti-Ukraine stance in the past. I do think the Netherlands will no longer be a frontrunner if this coalition comes together, the way it has over the past 2 years under Prime Minister Rutte. Now, I'll end with a few practical implications in the short run. In 3 weeks from now, there will be a European Council where acting Prime Minister Rutte will be still representing the Netherlands, but under the guidance of a completely new parliament, a more right-wing parliament. That council will talk about the multi-annual financial framework. It will discuss enlargement. So it's possible that Prime Minister Rutte will come with a different to-do list where he is mandated by a more right-wing parliament to take a tougher stance. So we have to be mindful and keep our eyes open for that European Council. True is Mr. Rutte is touted as being one of the front runners for the top jobs in NATO or the European Union after the June elections. That has changed. It's no longer guaranteed that the incoming government will support him, and it's no longer guaranteed that other countries will want him if the Netherlands is a right-wing government that has a different foreign policy. And then lastly, it's been mentioned already, the new parties that will form a government have very little government experience. They have very few people that have been ministers, have sat in government. So after the European elections, the Netherlands will have to delegate a new commissioner. I really wonder who that may be and whether that person will have the capacity and the experience to do what commissioners normally do, which is to bring a lot of foreign policy experience and a lot of policy experience, given that Mr. Wilders' party has no members, has never sat in government, and nor have NSC and BBB, the other two new parties that may join a government. Thanks very much.
Excellent, dear Sam. Thank you so much for reflecting on this very important points and flagging also the European Council upcoming summit, that all eyes are all on this summit, right? But now we have also underlined that we have to also be cautious when it comes to the perhaps conclusions. So we will be also looking into it at the EPC. We have the task force on the future of enlargement, and we will indeed follow up in a very attentive way. And dear Elizabeth, Sam has just also mentioned the potential implications on the Commission's agenda. And this is also one of the points that you mentioned in your analysis, a reaction to the Dutch election. Perhaps you can also comment on this, how you see the implications of these results on Commission's agenda, and also perhaps elaborate about the social consequences on domestic politics. How do you see the consequences at the domestic level, but also its interplay with the European policies? And then I will then go ahead with Rem as well, please.
Well, thanks, Teona. I think a really important point have you mentioned. I think indeed the fact that in June 24 we have elections, and of course already now, I think we clearly see, and already for some time saw already in the parliament, that the elections campaign has started. So I think it's very clear that the focus of the elections will indeed be on the green agenda, on migration, also the cost of living, and a need for a fair transition, a fair green and digital transition, where indeed there is the feeling, and I think that's really what we call the politics of discontent, that people are feeling being left out. And especially when it comes then to the European level, I think the same goes for what I also feel at national level when it comes to what government is holding for them, and you know, let's say the trust they have in the current systems. And I think in that respect, I think it's very cynical, and I think that's what you refer to, what I wrote in my piece, is that someone like Geert Wilders, but we also see that in France with Marine Le Pen, and to a certain extent in Hungary with Orban, although he, I think, has perhaps even more of an aggressive narrative, is that, you know, promises are being made about a welfare state, about, for example, healthcare, education, and it comes over as if indeed a politician, right, Wilders and other right-wing politicians have indeed what I call a very social agenda. However, at the same time, they also say that, again, that's rather an agenda that they would like to maintain at national level, because it's not something that the EU should deal with. And I think, as we all have seen during COVID-19, often these challenges are not challenges that can be dealt with at national level. You need collaboration. If you only think about, for example, demographic change that a lot of EU countries are dealing with, which has consequences for the way that we deal with our healthcare systems, for example, the health workforce, but also social welfare systems in general. Again, these are challenges that cannot be dealt with at EU level, and they need to be dealt with at EU level. They cannot be dealt with at national level. And I think also what we see at national level, that even though, again, these politicians are addressing the very genuine concerns of voters, that the solutions they offer are not for everyone. It's for the people that they count among their voters, but it's not for vulnerable groups, for example, like migrants or the queer community, just to give a few examples, that they feel their messages are not meant for. And I think that is very important to take into account, because the new Commission will have indeed massive challenges when it comes to indeed the implementation of the Green Agenda, migration, especially I think after discussions about irregular migration, but also, of course, refugees from Ukraine that have been taken on, and where we also see that solidarity has been shifting and has become more critical, and that will only become more urgent during the next mandate. And again, knowing that indeed the next Commission will also depend on the position of member states, realizing that indeed, as you mentioned, Teona, the last coalition talks, I think, took 290 days. And all of that will happen during the election of the EU for the EU institutions. And indeed, by usually it's December or January next year, we need to come up as the Netherlands with a name for the next European Commissioner. And all of that is not getting any easier, as the two previous speakers also have said. So, yeah, I think, again, the more assertive position that the Netherlands had over the last couple of years and a more pro-European position is very likely going to change, and that will not make the life of the EU institutions any easier.
Thank you so much, dear Elizabeth, for your comments. And dear Rem, perhaps I would like to ask you also about the winds of changes, as also some mentioned, but it's Orban who said, right, that this winds of changes is coming in Europe. So what are these winds? Do you believe that we will face indeed dramatic changes when it comes to the policies? And also, I would like to incorporate some of the questions coming from our participants that are asking about the agenda of Wilders. That yes, his campaign was was very much radical, we know, but then when it comes to the coming to the government and the prospects, then it becomes much milder, and we have this, remember these experiences from Italy, right? So do you think that his messages will be toned down, and what will be the consequences? And also some other questions, and I will incorporate later in the discussion, but please now go ahead with the implications.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And again, I might be hopelessly naive in thinking that there is still a possibility that we do not end up with a government led by Geert Wilders. But because, again, we are only 3 days in to life after the 22nd of November elections, I think it's really premature to assume that Wilders is going to be the prime minister, and he's going to have and that's going to be the face of the Netherlands in an international context. But if he is, I think it's worth underlining what that might do to the image of the Netherlands internationally. As I don't know, either Elizabeth or Sam have already mentioned, the fact that over the past 13 years, the Netherlands has had a single person representing the country in the EU Council, namely Mark Rutte, and whether you like him or not, he created a sense of stability, and over the years has developed into really one of the big European statesmen, again, whether you agree with his position or not. We know from research that the way in which a head of government is viewed is also important in terms of that country's ability to get things done in a European or international context. And whatever whether we end up with Wilders as prime minister, I think is hugely consequential for the way in which the Netherlands is going to be observed internationally. Just imagine what the dynamics are in, say, a North Atlantic Council meeting where President Erdogan and Geert Wilders are both there as formal heads of government. I mean, from a Dutch perspective, that in a way, I think slightly concerns me. The same holds with respect to EU Council meetings. Now, the other alternative, which I don't want to discount, is if Timmermans ends up leading a coalition. You're going to have a very different face, a very well-known face, if you will, in an EU context, and that's going to help the Netherlands also get its way. So I just want to underline how important actually the figurehead is, or the head of government, in terms of how the Netherlands is going to be perceived. And let me also remind you, it's not exceptional that the largest country or the largest party in the Netherlands doesn't form the coalition. I mean, the last time this happened was in 1982. Sure, many of us or participants here this afternoon weren't even born then, but still, before 1982, it was quite common that the largest party in parliament wasn't in power. And so perhaps I'm grasping at, or perhaps I'm reading too much into this. But again, I think it's important to underline that we're not there yet. If we do end up with a Wilders government, as some has eloquently expressed, there's going to be coalition negotiation, there's going to be a softening of positions. But where I absolutely agree with some is that there are going to be a number of areas which are going to be absolutely priority for a Wilders-led coalition, not because Wilders wants it, but because the other coalition partners want it as well. And here you need to look at migration. I think on migration, if we end up with the Wilders NSC government, perhaps or not supported explicitly by the VVD, the debate and the position of the Netherlands on migration is going to be much, much tougher than it has been right now. And this is going to align with views from Hungary, but also in Scandinavia. And so we're going to see how that's going to play out in a European context, where there's going to be a much more anti-migration bloc emerging inside the EU Council. And this, I think, is part of the winds of change bit of your question. I think and this is primarily to do with migration, how we deal with irregular migration, how we deal with that internally inside the EU, with the processing and the distribution of people around the union. It's going to be, I think, a massive headache. But that's really where I see the momentum of a Wilders-led coalition, which would also resonate at a European level. Secondly, I mean, some also mentioned it in regards to climate policy. Don't underestimate that it's not just Wilders that wants to get rid of climate policy, which is really, complete 180-degree turn as opposed to what Timmermans would bring to the table if he were to lead a coalition. Wilders really denies climate change as something that the Netherlands should worry about, which is interesting given that a large part of the country is below sea level. But the other coalition partners like NSC have flagged that we need to revisit Dutch climate policy. Now, revisiting climate policy isn't exactly the same as getting rid of it altogether, but the first steps are there to really try to assess, like, are we on the right trajectory? So I would expect also in terms of moving the Green Deal forward, implementing a number of the legislation regarding Fit for 55 could end up becoming quite problematic in that Dutch context. And here there will be some allies across the European Union. And a final point, and that's where I think that some's comment about the December Council is so interesting. You should expect, if there is a Wilders-led government, that the Dutch government will turn back to its frugal, roots. Even to the extent that Wilders throughout the campaign has said, we are now a net creditor, we need to be a net recipient of EU funding. And this is going to align with some of the instincts that you also see of the NSC and Pieter Omtzigt. Both Omtzigt and Wilders describe themselves as Eurosceptics, and that's primarily to do with EMU, Eurozone, MFF type of files. And so I think that you should expect more frugality in a European context. And here there's going to be a realignment again also with a number of Central Eastern European countries, if not with Scandinavians. Let me leave it there, Teona. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, dear Rem, also for your optimism, but also for warning that indeed we are not yet there, and it's premature to think that Wilders will create a government, because it depends on many factors, political factors that you have eloquently elaborated. However, also it's worth noting that it will be rather difficult to ignore the party that has succeeded to get 37 seats, right, in the opposition. So it will be also something rather difficult to ignore. So it's important also to reflect.
But if I may, it's interesting, because there's talk about this in the Dutch context now as well, and Wilders has tweeted about exactly this scenario, and he's doing that because he probably thinks that there might be a risk that he's going to be excluded from government. And he said, "You cannot avoid us, how much you like it, because we will come back with a vengeance and become bigger even next time." But that means that already he is anticipating this potential scenario where actually he isn't able to form a coalition government.
Indeed, he tweeted that they will become even bigger if this exclusion and this let's say ignorance will happen from the political parties. I would like also to incorporate the questions coming from our audience, but also my question to Sam and to Elizabeth is related to EU's enlargement agenda, which we have also touched upon, but also depending on the coalitions and depending on who is the government, do you think that in any case the position of Netherlands will, let's say, go back to its, as Rem said, to the frugal, let's say, spirit? And so not only enlargement, but also when it comes to the EU's potential institutional reform and qualified majority voting. And in this respect, will be interesting to hear your opinions. And a few questions also from the audience that relate to the strategy of the center-right and mainstream parties. What are the lessons in this respect, and how to prepare for the upcoming European Parliament election? And also a question I think it's important to ask about the impact the next coalition is going to have on addressing the US-led coalition building against the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. And voila, so at this stage, let's discuss these questions, and then I will come back with the additional questions. So perhaps some a few comments about it, yes.
Okay. A few general comments, and then I'll respond to your enlargement question. Well, first, I think we should start to see that what's happening in the EU is that backsliding and right-wing policies no longer go hand in hand everywhere, right? So in the past, it was Orban in Poland, where democratic backsliding, rule of law attacks were the same as anti-EU right-wing policies. I don't think that Wilders, even though he has voiced that rhetoric in the past against some of the rule of law standards, I don't think that he will be able to form a government around that. So backsliding is not likely to happen because of coalition, the coalition formation. But the anti-EU or the right-wing EU policies are probably likely to happen. So we should distinguish between those, and probably Wilders will be more in the camp of Meloni and of Sweden and Finland, who now also have EU skeptics in their government, rather than the Dutch government being in the camp of Orban or Slovakia Fico at the moment. I see a distinguishment between those two, and pulling in different directions on democratic backsliding and right-wing EU policies. Yes, there will be right-wing EU policies, but not necessarily democratic backsliding. Now, the enlargement discussions, if you look at the programs that all four parties that are now potentially going to be in a new government wrote and what they say about enlargement, you see that, again, Wilders is quite different from the other three. He is calling for basically giving up on support to Ukraine. He's against enlargement, whereas the other two or three say they are for enlargement, but with conditions, with very strict conditions on especially rule of law and democracy, which I think the EU itself and the Commission is also hammering on more and more. So even though they will be strict in monitoring whether Ukraine and other countries are following the rule of law and democracy agenda as part of the enlargement process, they will not block it as such, at least according to their programs. So again, there I think that Geert Wilders will compromise. He will not block enlargement per se, but he will join together with the other parties the more cautious group that really will want to monitor where the enlargement countries are going and only make steps as soon as really chapters have been closed and rule of law and democracy standards as such have been adhered to.
Yeah, and so I'm very happy to come in as well, because I think also an important point to make is that indeed earlier on in the conversation we said indeed that, you know, in the Netherlands you have new voices coming up, and indeed Wilders is perceived by, especially I think perhaps foreign commentators, as perhaps someone that didn't know that much. However, I think it's very important to realize that Wilders himself is really an old hand. I mean, he was a member of parliament for the Liberal Party since 1998, and he founded his party in 2006. So he himself knows very well what he's talking about, and he's very smart in positioning his agenda. I mean, I think it has been said during the campaign that his tone of voice became much milder. And even though it's true at the same time that, again, his party politics and his program still remained very outspoken, not to say radical, but I think as a politician, he's very smart in positioning himself. And again, that's why it's so important to see what's going to happen in the weeks and the months to come, because he knows very well what the boundaries are. For example, and I think that's one of the questions as well, of course, the Netherlands has committed not only to the EU treaties, but also to financial obligations. So not on all files, he will have the same margins. I'm sure that, for example, on the migration file, he will be more outspoken. There is more margin as well due to the ongoing negotiations. Whereas, for example, given the ongoing financial commitments that the EU, but also the Netherlands in the EU already has committed to, it's much, much harder to just withdraw that support. So I think that is very important to stress that, again, he as a politician will have its way. But I think it's also at the same time important to stress that other parties have a lot to lose when they govern with him. So that's also why you now see the VVD, the Dutch Liberals, backtracking and saying, well, we may want you to support you from the outside, but we're certainly not going to be part of a coalition. Also, the other coalition party from Pieter Omtzigt, the former centrist MP, who has now set up its own party in June this year, he has been saying that, yes, on the one hand, indeed, we need to respect the outcome of the elections. At the same time, again, there is the rule of law and also the importance of the EU that we subscribe to. So in that respect, your question about enlargement, I don't indeed see that perhaps there will be dramatic consequences all of a sudden. It will really depend indeed on the kind of coalition that emerges after indeed, the discussions that need started today, and where indeed already this morning we saw a hiccup with the fact that indeed the Explorer already was taking a step back, and that we still have to see what the next step is going to be in that respect.
Excellent. Thank you so much there, Elizabeth. Dear Rem, would you like to perhaps
comment?
Can
I come in?
Question?
Because I think it's Elizabeth's point about Omtzigt and the NSC is worth underlining because it, again, the Omtzigt and Wilders are going to be really strange bedfellows if they enter a coalition together. So sure, on the face of it, they're both, they want to push back on migration, they're anti-migration, they're both Eurosceptical, but on a number of other areas, actually to the core to Omtzigt's platform, they are diametrical opposites. So Omtzigt has said, and he's formed his new party based on a new social contract. That's what NSC stands for, new social contract. And the basis of that new social contract is to give power back to Parliament and take it away from, say, government ministers that simply go around and strike deals to push policy forward, and to really give the primacy of political momentum back to Parliament. He wants to set up a constitutional court. He wants to make all these issues of legislative reform that would really underline or even strengthen rule of law. And here you have Wilders, who basically says, well, Parliament is a circus, and it's the judges are clowns. And so if Omtzigt decides to normalize Wilders by going into a government with him, he's also going to fundamentally undermine or challenge the core premise on the basis of which he's built his own party. And in terms of electoral victory, it's very interesting to see that both the PVV and the NSC almost gained an equal amount of votes from previously. So the PVV got, say, 1.5, 1.6 million votes extra based on the previous elections of 2021. And the NSC also got about 1.5, 1.6 million votes. So they both have sort of new constituencies that they need to support. So again, this is just to say it's not a given at all. Now, you also mentioned what are sort of lessons that the center-right should learn from Wilders' victory. One is be really careful about what you do if you start to normalize the hard right. And one of the real political strategic, I think, blunders that the VVD, so Mark Rutte's party, made is that two things. One is they triggered the collapse of the government around an issue connected to migration, with the idea that the next election, so the one that we just previously had, would be about migration. It would be a migration election. Well, on migration, sure, the VVD is tough, but there are other parties that are a lot tougher, like Wilders. And so if you start to make an election about one specific theme that you know that you don't own, there is a real risk that it starts to become an opportunity for a party with more extreme views on this to gain. Secondly, at some point, a couple of weeks ago, profiles were being written about Dilan Yeşilgöz, so the leader of the VVD party, presenting her already as, the Netherlands' first female prime minister. Quite astonishingly, the Times in the UK described her as the most famous Dutch refugee since Anne Frank, which I thought was a really deplorable way to describe her. But there was this image that it was her election to lose. And because there was such an enormous emphasis on her, she started to say, well, I'm not necessarily going to exclude Wilders, or at least the voters of Wilders, creating this sense that a vote for Wilders could actually emerge to become relevant for government formation. And what she effectively did by statements like that, and I think to a certain degree because she already thought that electoral victory was hers, is that she opened the door to the possibility of going into power with Geert Wilders. All of a sudden, Wilders has been around, like Elisabeth said, since forever. He's going to be the Nestor, so the oldest member of parliament, quite soon. That a party that had been excluded, but consistently was able to attract 15 or 20% of the vote, but was always been excluded from government, all of a sudden, that vote, that protest vote, now started to become a realistic option to get into government. And that created an enormous amount of momentum behind him. So the lesson for center-right parties is twofold. Don't try to campaign on an issue that you know you're not going to be the dominant voice in. And secondly, really be very careful if you start to normalize the hard right as a potential coalition partner, because it might end up you might end up with a problem of your own.
Thank you very much for this takeaway messages. So don't imitate, and to be very careful. And also, as you mentioned, to perhaps maintain this cordon sanitaire, which has been broken, right? And this normalization has happened not only in Netherlands, but also we know other cases. We have 5 minutes left. Unfortunately, I cannot cover all the questions coming from the participants, but I'm sure we will have also another occasion at another EPC events, and also the publications that our participants will have a look. But perhaps a final question inspired by the one of the questions that I see here is the public mood in Netherlands, but also in Europe, and whether you think that this public mood is becoming more inward-looking, and indeed, if you also look at it to the polls before these elections, so we saw that the priorities were changed, with the concerns more over cost of the living and migration, and perhaps also this surpassing the climate change priorities of the citizens. So what would be your observation in this respect, and how the political leaders at the EU level also should address ahead of the European Parliament elections? So, dear Sam, perhaps we start with you.
Sure. Now, what lessons do we take from this? For me, it's lesson number one is we have to take the citizens seriously. There was a clear signal that the election outcome has given to the Netherlands. What I started with, the distrust in government following all the scandals, the emergence and victory of a few completely new parties, or Wilders' own party, which is not new, but of course has always been an outsider. That's a sign that citizens want something different, and that they believe that government is not delivering the way it used to, or at least they felt in the past. So we have to take the citizens seriously, and we can't just always play the game of political tactics, because citizens can sniff it out. That's one. But two, I think the lesson for other countries is we have to take democracy and the rule of law serious. The Netherlands has this coalition system that will prevent Mr. Wilders from implementing all his plans, but he has in the past said that that judges are not neutral, that the media are not neutral. He has called Parliament a fake Parliament. He has proposed that judges after 6 or 7 years in the job are vetted to see if their contracts can be renewed. These are all warning signs that we see are very similar to what we have seen in Hungary and Poland in the past. It will not happen in the Netherlands in the near future because of our coalition system, but we have to be vigilant to make sure that these things don't happen. So that's my final advice.
Thank you. Dear Elizabeth, what do you think?
Well, I think I very much concur with what Sam just said, because I think it's very important. I think it also goes back on the one hand to the question that Maria Mertzes asked in the chat, but also Joost van Eersel's question about, indeed, is this going to be a trend about inward-looking voters? And I think for me, indeed, what is really important when we speak about respecting democratic outcomes is that we need to respect the concerns that voters have conveyed. And I think the concerns to a certain extent are very sincere. I mean, it is concerns about changing societies, changing demography, as I meant before. I mean, people clearly feel that indeed societies are in transition. Also, when you think about the effects of artificial intelligence, with massive consequences for the future of work. I mean, that's something that we also look into at the EPC with some projects that we're currently leading on. So again, it's all very understandable. Also, when you think, for example, about retirement, that is, of course, where retirement ages are going to increase. I mean, all of this really impacts people. And I think we need to take all these concerns seriously. However, of course, what you do with it, and indeed how you build your politics around it, I think the Netherlands now had a very stark lesson, I think also for mainstream parties that really see their support decreasing, because it's astonishing if you think back indeed about what mainstream parties looked like in terms of their size just 10 years ago and where they stand now. I mean, a lot of the mainstream parties really don't have more than half of what they had in the past. And I think that is a big lesson that perhaps if you want to sort of copy the populist right, people rather vote for the original. And therefore, I think also mainstream parties need to take the concerns of their voters very seriously, both at national, but certainly also at EU level.
Thank you. And perhaps, dear Rem, a final thought from you, and then I will wrap up.
Yeah, sure. Final thought. I mean, one is I thought that Elizabeth and some comments were very well made. I think the point is that, of course, there is a sense of inward-lookingness now in Europe, but it's been going on for quite some time. If you look at, I think, the trajectory that the Netherlands has made over the past couple of years is quite interesting. So in 2017, the Netherlands was still viewed to be sort of the last neoliberal economy standing of quite some size inside the EU. And then in 2017, there was this massive switch where all of the Southern European industrial policy was embraced about protecting certain sectors, giving subsidies, which was really a sea change as opposed to the way in which the Netherlands looked at international open rules-based trade. That is, I think, a symptom of raising the fences that you now also see in terms of a stance on migration, in terms of a stance on simply engaging with the rest of the world, where there are real questions being posed, not just by the Dutch, but also by other voters about whether sort of the benefits of globalization, whether it's open borders or open trade, or to a certain degree, the open flow of ideas and cultures is beneficial to the Dutchman or the European. And I think we see that not just with the rise of parties like this, but also in other policies that we tend to take a much more beneficial view towards. So I think this inward lookingness is definitely a feature of European politics writ large. I think it's going to play out in the EP elections, but I would also hesitate, again, to draw too many conclusions based on the Dutch vote, because again, we don't know for sure yet who the prime minister is going to be. Also, we are a parliamentary democracy. We're not a prime ministerial democracy, which means that parliament needs to find a majority, and that's the basis for the government, not who necessarily the biggest party is. It's not exceptional not to have the biggest party deliver the prime minister. And also, Dutch elections are never about foreign policy or about European policy or about international policy. I'd like to see it be different, but they never are. And so, unfortunately, I wouldn't read too much into this, that, again, this time around, it wasn't about foreign policy either.
Thank you so much for your comments, dear Rem. I would like to thank our esteemed speakers for your great contributions and reflections. I think we had really fascinating discussions, discussing not only the implications of these elections for domestic politics, but of course its implications for the EU's policies and politics. I was very glad to have moderated this event, and I would like to thank cordially to Elizabeth Kuiper, Associate Director and Head of the Social Europe and Wellbeing Program at the European Policy Center, to Rem Korteweg, Senior Research Fellow at the Clingendael Institute, and Sam van der Staak, Director, Regional Europe Program, International IDEA. Thank you so much also to our participants for your active participation and questions that we have received, which we could not unfortunately cover all of them in depth, but of course you will follow us in social media, but also in person at the EPC events and the publications. Thank you once again, and see you next time. Have a nice day.